Today is Thursday, December 19th, 2024. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. Will the hostages ever come home? We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. You can email us as well, quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. Good story ideas. Just want to say, hey, whatever you want to do. That's our email address. We'll see it. Send it along. Joining me now to get through the news of the cray, as we're doing here each and every weekday, bright and early, Trey Phillips and Billy Hallowell. A lot to get to, as always. Guys, on the focus story, Disney kind of makes what seems to be a pretty stunning reversal from what they've been doing in the past.
Yeah, they are removing content that might be offensive, and so I don't want to spoil it. We'll get into it, but they also put out a statement about parental rights that was pretty shocking.
Yeah, could be a sign again of the pendulum swinging back. We'll see. Talk about that on the focus. On the main thing, RFK Jr. is aiming to make big changes as Department of Health and Human Services chief. CBN's Jenna Browder has more on that for the main thing coming up. Make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts, DC Debrief with John Stolnis, Billy's Newsmakers, also the Jesus and the Prophecies of Christmas podcast. You don't want to miss that. We are running the next episode of this on Saturday. It's episode 3. The final episode on 4 will be on Monday. Make sure you can get it on this feed, but you can also follow the Jesus and the Prophecies of Christmas podcast feed. We'll have the link to that in the description here below. All right, with that, we are going to head over to the news now in 90 seconds. The House Ethics Committee voted this month to release its report on former Representative Matt Gaetz before the current Congress ends, reversing an earlier decision to withhold it. The report is expected to go public after lawmakers conclude their final votes of the year. Though the committee still could change course, the decision marks a rare instance of releasing an ethics report after a member has left Congress. And this would revisit allegations of misconduct against Gaetz. Gaetz, for his part, has denied all of the allegations. He's called this a witch hunt and points to his exoneration in a separate DOJ probe, maintaining he never had inappropriate contact with minors. Did admit, though, that he had lived a different lifestyle in the past with partying, womanizing, etc., but says he now leads a different lifestyle. And a deal to free Hamas-held hostages remains uncertain, with some reports suggesting progress, while others caution against overestimating an imminent resolution. Hamas proposed releasing hostages in small groups in exchange for ceasefire extensions, a strategy rejected by freed hostages and families of those still held, who demand the release of all captives at once. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out those stories and more over at cbnnews.com. Guys, there's another story that's on cbnnews.com right now, and didn't have time to mention it there, but I found very interesting, and I wanted to talk about it just briefly. But actress Ali Larter, who left Los Angeles during the pandemic and moved to Idaho. They thought it was going to be like a short-term thing. A whole write-up on this over at cbnnews.com. And she talked about the move being, sparked by all the schools were closed, et cetera, et cetera. But then they just ended up loving Idaho, and then they decided to stay out there. And I just thought this was so interesting because, you see people in your circle, some love the city, some love the country. I feel like we're moving more towards, as we get more into remote work, I feel like people are just saying, forget this. What are we doing with the stress and the high pace of the big city, and going out to the country? They love the small town environment there, the close-knit people, how nice they are there, and how, kind of close-knit everybody is out there. And just saying, like, they didn't even know this option of life was possible, but they're loving raising their kids there. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, because as I get older, I feel like I have sort of similar longings, but I don't, to be out into more country and being out away from all the hustle and bustle. And maybe it's just me getting older, or is this a cultural trend that's increasing?
I don't know. I think it's a cultural trend. And I think, for somebody like you, Dan, or me, who commuted into New York City for a long time, who walked, took the subways, did all the things you had to do, I thought, this is the life I want to live. This is wonderful. And then about 5 minutes into it, I was like, what in the world? There's a better way. And I think when you start to experience that there's a better way, you want to do that less. And look, there are other people who stay in the city forever and they're happy. But I think the point is, I think people realize that you mentioned the way people are being treated, right? Like noticing that people are kind, that sort of thing. That's the kind of stuff you notice in a smaller town where the pace is a little better. So I love that.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, it's the culture that they want to live in, right? They may like the fast pace and the fact that, I mean, it's great being in a bigger city because you have access to so many things that are, really readily available to you, which can be great. But I think people are, especially as they get older, their priorities shift and they realize, well, actually I want to have a family and to be able to raise kids in a community that is loving to one another, and those close knit relationships exist. And unfortunately, I think because cities are so post religious and post Christian now, and so many cities are so progressive, it's just the fact that you can't find it there. So I think if you could find it there in a big city, maybe. That's why I think Tennessee is so appealing to people, because you can be kind of close to Nashville, which is a big city, and it's a more conservative state overall. So I think it's telling that a lot of people are moving to places like Tennessee.
Yeah, and also too the social media dynamic that we've talked about, how people are less and less connected. They feel, even though we're technically more digitally connected, we're less and less physically connected, emotionally connected with actual friends, not just people that are listed as a friend on some social media app, right? And I think maybe people are longing for more of that, more of the real and less of the fake. So if you want to read their story over there, it's on cbnnews.com. It's a great little write up there talking about that. Gives you something to think about for sure. Food for thought. All right, we are going to head over to the focus story now, and Disney might be reversing course potentially on its woke journey. Hear us out here. Give me the story.
Okay, so yeah, this is an interesting one. Now, there is a Pixar show. Disney owns Pixar, that is coming out. I believe it's their first animated series from Pixar. They always do films. And it's coming out in February. It was supposed to come out in December. It's apparently been delayed at least once, and I don't know if this is why it's being delayed, but Disney has reportedly cut out a storyline from this show. And the show's called Win or Lose. And it's a show, just before we even get into the scene that's being cut out, about co-ed middle school softball players, right? So you have a sports theme and you have kids, right? And obviously we know the debate over girls sports right now is huge. It has been heating up. And apparently the scene that they've removed deals with the transgender issue and gender identity. And so you've got that sports factor, and Disney decided reportedly months ago to make this decision. And this was reported by The Hollywood Reporter initially, and Deadline and some other outlets have done follow-ups on this. But they actually got a statement, and I know Fox News got this statement as well, from Disney, again, the owner of Pixar. And here's what the statement said. When it comes to animated content for a younger audience, we recognize that many parents would prefer to discuss certain subjects with their children on their own terms and timeline. That's a pretty stunning statement to come from Disney. And again, this was a scene that was in the show, apparently planned to be in the show. They even hired an individual a teenager who identifies as transgender, to play this particular role, to voice the role. And so to pull that scene out, pretty big deal.
Yeah, I mean, definitely an interesting statement. We'll dive more into that in a minute here. But what's the actor at the center of this project saying about all this?
So this individual's named Chanel Stewart, a teenager, and apparently the casting happened a few years back. I believe this individual is now 18 years old. Again, they identify as transgender. They expressed disappointment in an interview with Deadline, said that the character will now be a, quote, straight cis girl. So I don't know what the character was supposed to be before, but I assume because it was dealing with gender identity that this was going to be a transgender character. So the character purportedly, according to this actor, is being changed as a result of this decision. Now, this individual's mother, Keisha, also spoke to Deadline and said that this was upsetting. I'll read some of her quote. She said, "There may be some parents out there who are not ready to have that conversation, but this is the world that we live in, and everyone should be represented. Everyone deserves to be recognized." And it felt like it was just another setback for the LGBTQ community because it's very hard on transgender teenagers. And she kind of goes on to say, this is tough for them. But I will tell you, obviously, parental rights advocates are rejoicing. Ali Marr, the executive director of American Parents Coalition, they actually sent a statement to CBN and said that this was basically a step in the right direction and that parents should be in the driver's seat.
Yeah. And why do you think this change of pace is so surprising? Like when you look at the statement and everything else?
Yeah, I think it's surprising because Disney has pretty much, from everything we've seen, done the exact opposite of this, right? They have taken these themes, they have inserted them. If you go back to 2022, that was a very bad year for Disney. I think they thought they were heading in the right direction by embracing these themes. If you think back, you had the film Lightyear, which is about Toy Story character Buzz Lightyear, and that featured a same-sex relationship and a kiss, and it drew the ire of lots of people who were very upset to see that in kids' content. And as I recall, the film did not perform anywhere near as well as they had wanted it to. And so you started seeing a pattern of Disney and Pixar struggling, not in every film, but in a number of films as a result of inserting these themes. And I won't go through the whole history of this because we have covered it a lot, but you'll also remember that film, Lightyear, it was in the context of ex-Disney CEO Bob Chapek, his initial decision to not get involved in Florida's Parental Rights and Education Act. If you remember the whole drama about that, Disney didn't want to get involved in that. And then when I think the LGBTQ community and others pushed back, they ended up getting involved, going all in, wanting to overturn that law. So Disney really put themselves at the center of the culture war. And there were other examples as well. The only other thing I'll mention, you will also remember those leaked videos from Disney leaders in 2022, same year, talking all about LGBTQ content at their Reimagine Tomorrow Summit. That was a big deal where some very strange things were said about the content and what they wanted to put in it. So that really hurt Disney.
Yeah. And and I was going to mention those videos as well if you didn't bring it up. But one of the things was, which is why I think the statement and the quote that you read that, hey, especially with kids content, this should be something parents, do on their own timeline, their own time they want to do it. We shouldn't force it down their throats, essentially, is what they're saying, which stands in direct opposition to what one of their big content producers was saying, which was, we have a not so secret gay agenda. And I even started I like the Star Wars stuff. And so, I kind of bite the bullet and will watch the Disney Plus because that's where some of the Star Wars stuff lives now. But they've got a new show called Skeleton Crew, and there's one scene. It's very minor, but these kids go missing or whatever, and the parents are all there. And of course, there's like 4 sets of parents, and then one of the sets of parents appears to be 2 people of the same gender, but it's like very brief and very minor. And so that's the sort of stuff that, people kind of, I think a lot of times just let slip and let it go because it's so minor and not really essential or integral to the thing. You almost have to catch it to notice it. But the other things like these main storylines and really kind of cramming it down and making it such a big point of emphasis is what people are like, it just detracts from the show. It almost doesn't even matter what the message is. Any message you're trying to jam through is going to annoy people if it's distracting from the quality of the show. And that's all this ends up doing is it distracts. And so you have to recalibrate. If you're a company like Disney trying to make good movies and good entertainment, why would you just immediately alienate half or more of your audience?
I think that is what is so frustrating about it and why it is so annoying to people is because it doesn't feel natural. So often these
Yeah.
storylines feel like super forced. So it's if it was just in there and a passing scene like what you're describing in the show you're talking about, Dan, then even though I disagree with it, whatever, I might not have even noticed it, and it was just so just passe. That's like, okay, I don't care. But so often it's like it becomes this subplot line in the movie. It's the secondary storyline And especially for a show that's geared toward kids, at that point, it just feels so forced and so intentional, and you're trying to push the issue that I think people are just really turned off by it. I am encouraged to see Disney realizing, okay, I'm not saying that they're doing it for any sort of like they've had this great moral awakening. I think what
They don't want to go bankrupt.
yeah, I was going to say what they realized is the dollars and cents of it, right? Is that it just doesn't make sense financially for us to keep pushing it. Though that is surprising because they had 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 movies that came out where they pushed that storyline in every single movie they put out, knowing full well that it was going to fail. So the fact that the pendulum is swinging in the other direction this late in the game is kind of interesting for
Right.
Disney to do. I mean, and I don't know, is this really a pendulum swing? Maybe not. It might just
could be a
this
one-off.
might be a fluke.
Yeah.
I'll add one other quick thing. I do think it's part of a bigger pendulum swing because I think people have been in their silos, particularly on both sides, but on the left, and that's why you saw the election go the way it did. I mean, there are a number of things now that show that, oh no, maybe I shouldn't only listen to the 10 people around me because they're leading me in a direction that is not smart. Disney had to really believe that this was the right thing to do in every single level in order for them to take it that far, and to realize they were so wrong about it. Even if it is a one-off, I think it's a pretty big victory, but I think it is part of a pattern.
Yeah. We'll see. We'll see if it's a trend that continues, but certainly interesting to keep an eye on it for sure. Appreciate you bringing it to the podcast today. All right. Well, RFK Jr. is an interesting pick to be in President-elect Trump's cabinet, and he's aiming and talking about making big changes to our nation's health policies. And he confirmed to be the Department of Health and Human Services chief, and CBN's Jenna Browder has more on what could be ahead. That's today's main thing.
Number one killer today is not smoking, it's not war, not infections, it's food.
Make America healthy again. A movement that picked up steam during the 2024 election and has rapidly grown in popularity since.
In the last 50 or so years, there's been about 10,000 chemicals added to the American food supply, where countries in Europe only have 400 approved for use.
So what is it, and what could it look like in practice?
I'm not going to take away anybody's vaccines. I've never been anti-vax.
RFK Jr. wants to lead America's war on chronic disease. And if he becomes Secretary of Health and Human Services, will focus on reforming the federal government's health agencies.
93% of American adults have metabolic dysfunction. This is caused by our toxic food system and our modern lifestyle, which has changed rapidly over the past 50 to 75 years.
Dr. Casey Means, a Stanford-educated surgeon, and her brother Callie are advisors to RFK Jr. Her book, Good Energy, is also considered to be the health playbook for the incoming Trump administration.
What I saw in the healthcare system is that we're spending more money every single year on treating diseases, but patients in America aren't really getting better. Our rates of chronic illnesses are going up every single year. The more money we spend on healthcare, the sicker we're getting.
She tells CBN News up to 80% of diseases can be avoided by addressing their root causes. Means says RFK Jr. has a three-pronged agenda. 1, get conflicts of interest out of health agencies. 2, produce uncompromised, evidence-based research to establish guidelines for health standards. And 3, reverse the trend of the chronic disease epidemic.
I think this movement is such a long time in coming. It's so overdue for us to have a national conversation about why we are the sickest, fattest, saddest, most over-medicated population in human history.
Katie Talento, an epidemiologist by training, served as a health advisor to the first Trump administration. She says RFK Jr. and his team will likely start with structural reforms.
So, for instance, the types of advisory committees that are made up of outside experts, both at the CDC and at the FDA, are riddled with big pharma corruption. There's almost nobody who sits on those outside experts. And these are very powerful panels. There's almost no expert that sits on those panels that is independent of pharma money.
But legislation can't just be slashed, and she says certain laws and statutes could be a barrier. She adds the interpretation of those laws, though, is in the purview of executive branch officials, and how much they can do depends on how they navigate the regulatory tools available to them.
So, for instance, we have all these food additives, red dye number whatever and yellow dye number, and too many syllables than you can pronounce that are in all our food. Those additives, no one ever approved them as safe. They were never really going through clinical trials and showing that they're demonstrating through data that they're safe. They were given a designation by the FDA of generally recognized as safe, GRAS. And it basically means some scientist somewhere, probably on the food industry payroll, said that this is probably fine. Like, that's basically what happened. And so that kind of process that GRAS process can be dramatically reformed. And that designation can be removed forthwith, quickly, I think, from many, many of the poisonous and toxic or even questionable, we don't know, additives that are permitted in our food supply.
There is a chemical called Red 3 that's banned in lipstick, and it's been banned for a really long time, since 1990, over 30 years, but it's still allowed in strawberry milk drinks that we give to kids and cancer patients.
All right, so
this is the problem with our FDA.
This push faces an uphill battle, with strong interests already coming up against it. Talento sees it as a spiritual battle.
So how much you and I are praying and fasting for these initiatives will help determine how possible it is.
RFK Jr. will have his Senate confirmation hearing in January, where he'll be asked about all of this. Vaccines will also likely come up, as will his pro-choice views on abortion. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
All right, Jenna, thanks for that. It's going to be really interesting to see what RFK Jr. and the Trump administration does on this front, because, I mean, look, it is one of those, I mean, look, we like the freedom to eat whatever we want to eat, right? But I mean, I think it goes without saying that we aren't the healthiest bunch when you look around at Americans all over the place. It's a wide range. So it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. But all right. We got time on the podcast today for one last thing, and we are going to look at Proverbs 2:6. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, this is I mean, one of my favorite verses, and we've shared it on the show before, but everything we're talking about requires wisdom. And if we're uncertain, if we're unclear, Disney should have, prayed for some wisdom, and they wouldn't have ended up in this position.
Yeah, way to bring this verse back to Disney, Billy. But yeah, this is a good reminder to seek the Lord, because he is the author of wisdom.
All right. That's where we're going to leave it on this edition of the Quick Start Podcast. As always, get yourself on over to cbnnews.com, faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. Again, don't forget, we got Jesus and the Prophecies of Christmas, episode 3, coming up on Saturday, right here on this feed. You don't want to miss that. And as always, Lord willing, and that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back tomorrow with more. God bless. See you then.